Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Collegeville Connections, a monthly series of online events presented by the Collegeville Institute, located on the campus of St. John's University in Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs. It provides an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other and to the Collegeville Institute. Most importantly, you'll learn a lot from our remarkable guests. I'm Stina Kielsmeyer-Cook, Director of Communications at the Collegeville Institute. And before I introduce our guests for today, I'm going to turn to Jessie Bazan, who is a staff member at the Collegeville Institute. Jessie is running the tech side of things for us today and will tell us what we need to know about logistics. So Jessie.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, just three quick notes. So most of you, I think, are watching this on Zoom, but if for some reason you get kicked off or whatnot, this is also being live streamed on the Collegeville Institute Facebook page, so you can always hop over there. This presentation is also being recorded, so you can check back later today on our Facebook and YouTube channels to watch that or share it with your friends who may be interested. And then finally, there'll be some good time for questions and answers towards the end of the presentation. And we'd ask you, instead of using the chat function, to just use that Q&A button at the bottom. If you have any questions throughout, just pop them in through the presentation and we'll get to those at the end.
Thank you, Jessie. So now a few words about our presenter. Sophfronia Scott is a novelist, essayist, and leading contemplative thinker whose work has appeared in Time, People, the Oprah magazine, and numerous other outlets. At the Collegeville Institute, we're lucky to have Sophfronia as a writing coach in our 2021-2022 Emerging Writers Mentorship Program. When her first novel, All I Need to Get By, was published, she was nominated for Best New Author at the African American Literary Awards and hailed by Henry Louis Gates Jr. as one of the best writers of her generation. Her books include Unforgivable Love, Love's Long Line, and This Child of Faith. Scott holds degrees from Harvard and the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and she lives in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. We're very fortunate to have her with us today, so welcome to you, Sophfronia. And also, I would be remiss to say that she also is the author of this brand new book that we get to talk about today, which is called The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton. And you should all go grab a copy of this book. There's a link to where you can buy it on our website. But welcome, Sophfronia. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you, Stina. I'm excited to be here with you.
Great. Well, first to start us off, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book about Thomas Merton.
Well, yeah, often I don't go into books thinking, oh, I'm going to go write this book. Usually I find a question being presented to me or someone saying, that they don't know enough about something. And I figure, okay, I can do that. I can help with that. And I found myself on a panel at the Festival of Faith and Writing, which I don't know if you know that, it's at Calvin College every other year. So I was at the Festival of Faith and Writing. I think this was in 2018. And a friend had asked me to be on a panel about Thomas Merton. And this was my first time talking about Merton in public. And so I was really excited to do that. And I was sitting on the stage and suddenly, I don't know what came over me. I'm sitting there looking at my friend and the other person on stage with me. And it occurred to me that they have all of these deep academic studious credentials that I did not have concerning Merton or that level of academia. And so I said to the audience, I was like, just so you know, I'm going to confess here, I'm not an academic, I'm not a theologian. I'm just someone who has this monk who follows me around and gives me advice. And I'm going to talk to you about Merton on that level, just how my experience of reading his work and how it influences me. And for some reason that really spoke to the audience. And people kept coming up to me throughout the rest of the conference to talk to me about what I'd said. And finally, a woman said to me, "And you're writing your Merton book, aren't you?" And it's like light bulb was like, yes, I am. I am writing my Thomas Merton book. And if you had asked me that before the conference, if someone had said that to me, I would have said something like, oh, there are so many books about Merton and there's nothing that I could add to it. But the response of that audience made me realize, well, there is something there that people are curious about, and I can offer that. So yes, I can write my book about Thomas Merton, and I think I know what it can be.
I love that. So now that your book has come out and it was published just in March, has anything surprised you so far in the reception of it?
Well, Stina, I wanted the book to bring, number one, to bring a new audience to Merton, but number two, to do the thing that I just mentioned from the conference, to help people see what a personal engagement with Merton can be like, and encouraging people to say, this is my Merton, you can find your own Merton, you can develop this engagement on your own. And what's been exciting is seeing people do exactly that. And not just having to do with Merton, but with spirituality in general. Someone sent me a Facebook post that they had seen, and this wasn't even their Facebook post, this was somebody else's Facebook post, from a woman who was reading the book and feeling very envious that I was having some sort of spiritual experience, a mystical experience that she had never had. It's like, oh, why can't I do this? And feeling very frustrated about that. But she's sitting there and she keeps reading it, and she comes to this point where she's reading the section on prayer, and I'm talking about praying with icons. And for some reason, she decides to take her favorite icon off the shelf and put it in her lap while she continues reading the book. She then finds that I am quoting a scripture. I'm quoting John. It's actually a piece of scripture that I keep here on my desk. I'm quoting John 10. I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me. Neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. And she reads that, and she says in her Facebook post, for the rest of this story, see my icon. And the icon that she took off the shelf is the icon of the good shepherd. Right. So she had a moment there, right? She had this mystical moment. She realizes that it's not just someone writing books who can have this experience, that it's here, that it's now, that it's all of us, right? That we can reach out at any time and know that we are connected deeply to the one who's made us. So that's exciting to me. That is absolutely exciting.
I love that. And wow, what a powerful reader response to hear. And it seems like, from what you've said already about the feedback you got at the Festival of Faith and Writing, the scope of this book, the conversational tone kind of came from that feedback. But can you tell us a little bit more about writing a book in this format of writing directly to Thomas, addressing him in your prose? Did you struggle at all in coming in writing in this way, or tell us a little bit more, I guess, just about how you came to write it in this format?
It's funny, that feels, it felt most natural to do that. And if you think about it, Stina, don't we all talk back to the books we read? We do that. We do that anyway.
Or throw them across the room sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a Silver Linings Playbook. I was just watching that recently on cable, and Bradley Cooper's character is reading A Farewell to Arms, and he's so mad at the ending, he throws it out a window, breaking the window, right? So we all do that. So all I did was put it on paper, and I was pulled, I feel pulled into conversation with Merton because I was reading his journals. And those journals are extensive, 7 volumes, big books and really tiny print that he started writing. He started journaling when he was very young, right? In his early 20s. So there is a personality that you get to see develop over time, and talking back to him over time, right? And it changes. And so I say in the book that there are times when I feel like I'm engaging with him as though I'm a mother. Other times a college classmate. Another time as a peer who is the same age that I am. And it just feels that way because of that is the voice that is in those journals, and it's different at every age. So that just felt absolutely natural that I would write in that way and call him what I feel I would have called him if I had known him. I probably, knowing my personality and knowing his, I would have called him Thomas. I don't care if everybody else called him Tom or Father Louis. That would, and I heard him heard him. He said that once to some little girls that he met once in Cuba, who asked, well, what's your name? And he said, Thomas. And so to me, it's like, I'm going to call him Thomas. So that's what I did in the book.
Yeah, so you spend a lot of time reading some very personal journals, and I think these journals were sealed, right, until 25 years after his death. Can you tell us a little bit about the research that you did and the writing process? Did you write in response after you read a journal, or did you kind of go through all of the journals at first and then start writing the book?
Well, remember that the idea for the book happened because of the way I was talking about Merton, and that came from already being deeply into reading these journals. So the challenge of the book was figuring out, as with any book, it's figuring out structure, right? So how will I shape this book, and what types of things will I talk about? And that came about just from being in conversation with other well-lettered friends, people like Willie Jennings at the Yale Divinity School, who in our conversations about the book, Willie, I'm writing this book, and his encouragement and just saying, yes, this is going in the right direction, because not a lot is spoken about Merton and this particular topic, and it would be interesting if you engaged him on that level. So that's what helped me start thinking about, okay, topics. So looking at the topics that I struggle with and that I see in that we as a society continue to struggle with, ambition, race, materialism, empathy, spirituality. So I laid out those topics. This is what I'm going to do. Now, some of the engagement involved having to go deeper sometimes. So what did he mean by X? Or he's referencing in his journals a book he'd written. So I would have to go find that book. If I wanted to know more about his engagement with nature, I'm going to go, read his photography books. I'm going to go read other books that discuss his engagement with nature. So I'm not a person who goes into general research. I write to a point where I realize I need to know something, and then I go and research that particular piece. To me, and maybe this is from my journalism days, but it's about how to research without getting overwhelmed by something. So that's how I do it. I'm looking for something specific and not a big overarching research thing.
That makes sense. And it's one of the chapters which I'm gonna invite you to read from now. For folks who haven't yet read the book, Sophfronia is gonna read from a chapter called Hopeless Eyes on a Hopeless Issue. And it is about Thomas Merton and race. So is there any introduction or any words you'd wanna use to introduce this before you read from it, Sophfronia?
One note pertaining to the structure of the book, because I told you I came up with these topics, right? And one of the topics was race. And as I wrote the chapters, I basically told my editor of Broadleaf Books, Valerie Weaver-Zerker, I said, okay, here are these chapters. I have no idea what order they need to be in. And also, I tend to talk about Merton just as we're doing here. Notice we haven't introduced Merton, right? We haven't said anything about who Merton is. There may be people on this call who don't know who Thomas Merton is. And so she kept pointing that out to me. And so I realized, okay, not everybody knows who Merton is. So how do I handle that? And she came up with the brilliant idea of kind of providing biography of Merton throughout the book. So the book is structured following his lifeline, right? The timeline of his life. And so, the earliest parts deal with things that he would have dealt with entering the monastery up until the time of his death. So this part of the book that I'm about to read refers to his writings of the 1960s when he became engaged with the civil rights movement and writing very thoughtfully about race and nonviolence.
Great. Well, we'll give you a chance to find your page. I'm going to go off camera while you read, and then when you're done, I'll follow up with some questions, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. I want to talk to Thomas Merton about race. One might doubt whether a cloistered white man who lived in Kentucky in the middle part of the last century would have anything useful to offer. But this particular monk knew that such a conversation is never about race alone. Talking about race means, among many things, sharing our fears and frustrations about our place in the world, about how people are treated, about a hope for better opportunities that never seem to materialize. In other words, it's about dignity, respect, a shared humanity, and ultimately, our hearts and souls. Racism is not just about white people treating people of color badly. It is about how the repercussions of that treatment reverberate for everyone to the detriment of us all. There is something so intuitive about Merton's views that I think talking to him about race would be helpful. I have a hunch that he, unlike many white people, would be willing to go to the heart of the matter in a way that doesn't focus on him. Merton moved to the United States in the late 1930s when African Americans were referred to as Negroes, and segregation was a fact of life. His own position, that of a young white man and a Columbia University student, was a privileged one that would have allowed him, if he chose, to ignore the injustice and inequality imposed on people of color. But somehow he was able to look at race and say quite coherently that something was very wrong. When he was a teacher at St. Bonaventure's College in New York, he met Catherine DeHook, who visited the school to speak about the conditions in Harlem and the community center she ran there, Friendship House. Merton asked her afterward if he could come to Harlem and volunteer. She agreed, and he arrived via subway on a rain-soaked, humid day in August 1941. His impression of Harlem affected him so deeply that he would recall it with stunning power years later in the 7-story mountain. Quote, "Here in this huge, dark, steaming slum, hundreds of thousands of Negroes are herded together like cattle, most of them with nothing to eat and nothing to do. All the senses and imagination and sensibilities and emotions and sorrows and desires and hopes and ideas of a race with vivid feelings and deep emotional reactions are forced in upon themselves, bound inward by an iron ring of frustration. The prejudice that hems them in with its 4 insurmountable walls. In this huge cauldron, inestimable natural gifts, wisdom, love, music, science, poetry are stamped down and left to boil with the dregs of an elementary corrupted system. And thousands upon thousands of souls are destroyed by vice and misery and degradation, obliterated, wiped out, washed from the register of the living, dehumanized. Harlem is there by way of a divine indictment against New York City and the people who live downtown and make their money downtown. The brothels of Harlem and all its prostitution and its dope rings and all the rest of the mirror of the polite divorces and the manifold cultured adulteries of Park Avenue, they are God's commentary on the whole of our society," unquote. He returned many times to Friendship House. He looked after children, led prayer services, sorted through clothing donations. He thought seriously of making Friendship House his own life's work and went back and forth trying to decide whether to live in poverty serving God in Harlem or to live in poverty serving God as a monk in Kentucky. He eventually chose the cloistered existence. Once he entered the monastery, Merton wrote little about race, but those pages in his autobiography were enough for the leaders of the civil rights movement to mark him as an ally. When he took up the subject again years later, as the civil rights movement gained steam, Merton came to the table with credibility. In 2019, Gregory K. Hillis of Bellarmine University, which houses the Merton Center, summarized Merton's 1963 essay, The Black Revolution, Letters to a White Liberal. Quote, overarching the entire essay is Merton's conviction that the oppression of African Americans is systemic, and that white liberals, A, do not do enough to fight against the racism baked into American society, and B, are in fact guilty of propping up this racist system for their own well-being, unquote. In the same article, Hillis quotes a man who said he carried one of Merton's books in his pocket when crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965, and a Black woman who said she, quote, felt alienated by her church and religious community for her civil rights work in the 1960s, but Merton got it when few others did, unquote. Eldridge Cleaver, the founder of the Black Panther Party, notes in his autobiography, Soul on Ice, how he would often reread Merton's Harlem pages in the autobiography whenever he felt his resolve weakening. Quote, the passages helped him to become once more a rigid flame of indignation, unquote. Sounds like I've come to the right monk for this conversation. Yet, I don't want to be a rigid flame of indignation. I don't want my life weighed down by anger, hopelessness, and resentment. How do I do that, Thomas? I still think about the 2015 video showing a Black man, Walter Scott, who had been stopped for a traffic violation, being gunned down by a police officer. Scott is running away when the white officer fires 8 shots at his back. He falls face down and the officer handcuffs him that way. The officer does not check to see if he is breathing. He does not turn him over. He tosses a taser near the man's body. Later, he claimed that Scott had tried to take it from him. Scott receives no assistance, not even from the Black officer who later arrives on the scene. Scott dies at the scene. The coroner later said that Scott was struck 5 times. He was unarmed. Discussing the video with a friend, we talk about the shock of witnessing the killing, of watching Walter Scott fall, of the bitter taste in our mouths after seeing him hit the ground. What really leaves our souls scorched and grieving is the casual behavior of the police officer who fired the weapon. It's as though this event was not extraordinary for him, as though he had no sense of the impact of his action, that he had ripped a precious life from the world. It's this sense of my soul being scorched that I need to heal, Thomas. I don't want to pass it on to my son. In 1963, Merton met a young Black priest, August Thompson, who visited Gethsemane from his home parish in Alexandria, Louisiana. A few months later, Thompson wrote to Merton for guidance after being berated by his bishop for speaking out on the poor treatment of Black people in the Catholic Church, how they could only receive communion after whites had already received it, how white Catholics would rather pay someone to drive a Black Catholic to another town for church than have the person attend in their parish, how Thompson himself was prohibited from saying Mass at white parishes, and how some white Catholics refused to call him father. The church had betrayed its Black congregants and all notions of Christian love by only giving them more of what they experienced daily in the secular world. It's striking to me that the advice you gave him, Thomas, appealed to the priest's loving heart and not his indignant mind. You instructed him to handle his bishop's disapproval with compassion. Quote, you have to take into account the absolute blindness and absolute self-righteousness of people who have been schooled by centuries of prejudice and injustice to see things their way and no other, unquote. To tell you the truth, Thomas, I would have taken this as a condescending word from an out-of-touch white monk. It sounds too much like the white moderates of the day. Be patient. Don't ask for too much. Change happens slowly. But I realize I need to be patient with the words in your response and understand that what you were trying to do for Thompson is what I need to do for myself. You wanted him to take care of his heart first. If he kept bashing himself against the stone wall of the bishop's blind racism, it would only lead to disillusionment and then anger and pain. But if he led with a loving heart, he could instead seep into the stone like water trickling down a mountain and eventually crack the mountain open from within, all without compromising his own emotional health. You sought to teach Thompson the essence of nonviolence. Having studied Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest, you read and taught to your novices Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a burning Birmingham jail. You learned that nonviolence is not only a way of protest, but a way of being. That if one is careless in thought and words, one can be violent without realizing it. Quote, where minds are full of hatred and where imaginations dwell on cruelty, torment, punishment, revenge, and death, then inevitably there will be violence and death, unquote. You wrote this. This tells me that if I want to escape anger and hopelessness, my focus shouldn't be on the wrongs being done. I have to begin with my humanity. I could be ruled by what I see, the ongoing occurrences of racism and hate crimes and the long shadow of police shootings of unarmed Black men. In order to release the power of these instances over my mind and heart, it is imperative that I unravel some of the complicated threads within myself. The writer Robert Vivian once lectured on how we all have immortal wounds, events in our lives we simply cannot get over. James Baldwin never got over his stepfather's ruthless abuse or the racism that made him leave the US to live in Europe. These wounds showed up in everything he wrote. Vivian suggested that if we understood our wounds, we would understand what makes our writing unique. My wound is betrayal, and the betrayal wasn't even my own. I was 11 years old when the miniseries Roots, the Saga of an American Family aired on television. I was fascinated by the friendship between the enslaved girl Kizzy and the slave owner's daughter, Missy Ann. Missy Ann teaches Kizzy how to read. Maybe this was the source of my fascination because I love to read. I didn't understand, though, how this went against the law of the time and how dire the consequences were. After Kizzy writes a note for a slave trying to escape, her skill is discovered and she is sold. She is put on a cart, and as her new owner prepares to haul her away, Kizzy is screaming for Missy Ann. I kept waiting for Missy Ann to appear, to say something, if only goodbye, to her friend. When she didn't come, I assumed she wasn't at home or had been put someplace in the house where she couldn't hear Kizzy. But then the scene cuts to Missy Ann, sitting calmly despite the screams. She coolly observes how stupid Kizzy has been. And that's it. I couldn't believe the betrayal, the bonds of friendship torn asunder. I wondered if the bond had ever been real in the first place. Betrayals, to me anyway, are about people who are supposed to know you. They intentionally put you in a place of having to be something other than yourself. Maybe I'm careful now only to allow people close to me who are unlikely to harbor betrayal, as if I can really tell. but that doesn't mean the wound is not at work within me. Merton wanted August Thompson to avoid focusing on betrayal and resentment when he advised him about his bishop. If he could focus on nonviolence instead, then Thompson had a better chance of achieving something greater. Hillis describes it as, quote, calling Thompson to work for his bishop's conversion, unquote. White religious leaders need to be converted too, a lesson we continue to learn. Merton says that's the purpose of nonviolent. Merton says that the purpose of nonviolent conversation is to, quote, awaken the conscience of the white man to the awful reality of his injustice, so that he will be able to see that the Negro problem is really a white problem, that the cancer of injustice and hate, which is eating white society and is only partly manifested in racial segregation with all its consequences, is rooted in the heart of the white man himself, unquote. Thomas, are you telling me the race issue is really an issue of faith? I'm willing to explore that. But the dialogue I've experienced, to my frustration, hasn't gone anywhere near an awakening of conscience. When I participated in conversations at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, we never seemed to get to a discussion of the current situation. The people who participated, most of them white, preferred to speak instead about what was, how they had participated in the civil rights movement, how they had attended protests and rallies, and how, yes, the Jim Crow era was terrible, but compared to that, things are so much better now. As well-meaning as they were, their words eventually began to sound like the trope, I have Black friends. What do I want to hear instead? I guess something along these lines, which Thomas you wrote in 1967, quote, I face the fact that I am living in an immoral society. I'm living in an immoral, blind, even in some sense criminal society, which is hypocritical, bloated, self-righteous, and unable to see its true condition. By and large, the people are nice as long as they are not disturbed in their comfortable and complacent lives. They cannot see the price of their respectability. And I am part of it, and I don't know what to do about it, apart from symbolic and futile gestures, unquote. If I heard that, Thomas, I think I would respond, I don't know what to do either. But the fact that we're here in this same place of not knowing is a really good place to start. From there, we could look at the bigger picture and also challenge ourselves as individuals to make change from within. We are called to be like the child in the fairy tale, the emperor's new clothes, willing to upset the conditions of our comfortable existence. Quote, our vocation as innocent bystanders and the very condition of our terrible innocence is to do what the child did and keep on saying the king is naked at the cost of being condemned criminals, unquote. If we don't become the truth tellers, then a different kind of erosion can happen in which resentment breeds, a resentment that would threaten the wholeness of my heart and soul. If nothing else, I must be whole and respond to racism in a way that is true to the depths of my being. What does that look like? We're getting on the same page, I think, Thomas, because something else you observed gives me hope. You wrote, quote, these Negroes are not simply judging the white man and rejecting him. On the contrary, they are seeking by Christian love and sacrifice to redeem him, to enlighten him, so as not only to save his soul from perdition, but also to awaken his mind and conscience, unquote. Redemption, yes. My friend and neighbor Jane, after reading my first novel, a story about a family dealing with drug addiction, said that I seem to be all about redemption. She added, you don't throw people away. I suppose redemption works in me so deeply that I don't always recognize when I'm doing it. Right now, I'm drafting a novel about an enslaved girl of mixed race and a white girl. They are half-sisters who share a father, a slave owner. As I work my way through figuring out the plot, developing the characters, and considering their actions, it occurred to me that yet again, I have Kizzy and Missy Ann on my mind. I am seeking to redeem Missy Ann, writing still from this immortal wound. As I read over my pages and see how I'm righting wrongs in my fictional worlds, I see how I am accessing compassion. And because I can access it, I can offer and model it for my son. In turn, he supports my hope. Already he's showing me the possibilities. I drive him 45 minutes to school and, depending on traffic, nearly an hour home each day so that he can attend an arts high school in an urban area. He studies theater and enjoys a more diverse environment in terms of race, class, and sexual orientation than we have where we live. He and his friends are so accepting of each other that even if they don't know someone's gender, they don't ask. They only care about the person, what their name is, the activities they favor, how they are doing on any given day. I think about this attitude blossoming throughout Tane's generation and the generations to come. It makes me feel an abundance of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophfronia, for reading that. For those in the audience, I want to invite you to please put some questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching this on Facebook, you can put a comment underneath the event page and ask questions for Sophfronia. But I'll start us off with some questions for you, Sophfronia. I loved this chapter and I learned a lot. I was really surprised to learn how Eldridge Cleaver, the founder of the Black Panther Party, would read Merton for inspiration, specifically his pages about Harlem, which you read for us today. And that phrase, he read them to become once more a rigid flame of indignation. And yet you're kind of pushing back in the book saying, I don't want to be a flame of indignation. And that kind of gets at the tension, which seems to be about how do we care about brutality in the world, racism, without becoming so overwhelmed and consumed by it. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, you know, I think it's important to recognize how events work on us physically. You know, what do we become when we behold injustice, right? And a lot of it feels absolutely awful. Now, how can we do the work that we need to do if inside we are feeling awful, if we are trying to hold on to a kind of anger, if we feel hopeless, if it makes us feel sick and depressed? That's not, to me anyway, that's not a space from which good work can come, right? And it also, there are emotions those are emotions that are by nature divisive, right? Because what we want to run from pain, right? We want to separate from it. We want to be angry and judgmental of the people who have caused that pain. But it seems to me that healing is about unity. And that unity can only happen if we have compassionate hearts, and that compassion has to reach out to the people who are doing the injustice, right? So I know I may be talking about things that sound like pie in the sky to a lot of people, but for me personally, I'm talking about my basic humanity and how I see it still speaking to the humanity of someone who at their heart may be acting out of ignorance, may be acting out of fear, may be acting out of God knows what that they are dealing with. So if I react to that person out of divisiveness and hatred, then that only separates us further. It doesn't bring us closer together. So even if that person has no inclination to move towards me, I still must move toward them.
I noticed that same tension in kind of the pushback you write about as the narrator in this chapter when you read Merton's advice to the young Black priest, August Thompson. You know, so Merton is advising just what you're saying, this compassionate heart. Tell us more about that pushback you felt when you were reading his words in our modern day.
Well, you know, that pushback is really, it's not just me. There are many who could have seen what he was saying that way. It's like, you know, be nice, you know, don't make waves, you know. So that's, you know, that's first inclination. But really to read it closely, to really get at the heart of understanding what is he saying to this person, right? It is about exactly what I just said. He's talking to this priest about understanding look at where your bishop is coming from. Your bishop knows nothing else but this kind of racive, divisive behavior. So therefore, it won't help to just go to him and complain, right? That you have to take other avenues, and to really think about nonviolence, to think about the avenues Merton is presenting to him. It makes sense. It makes sense to come from a place of heart, right? And not with clenched fists. So I think, and in any type of reading, right, we have an initial reaction, but instead of throwing the book out the window, it's like, okay, why am I having this reaction? Let's go back and look at it closer. What does this mean? What is he saying? Because Merton, as prolific as he is, you know, throwing out words and writing tons of things, he was not one to waste his words, right? He's trying to say something to this young man, especially when he wrote letters, right? And he wrote tons of letters. So he really wanted to speak specifically to this person. So I take that to heart and really took in his message there.
This touches on one of the questions in the Q&A, but I really love, you know, how you reflect on you as well as Merton being writers, and how truth-telling, you know, even with the complexities of addressing an issue like racism, truth-telling becomes essential. Can you tell us more about truth-telling and about how you work through some of these complexities in writing fiction?
Well, I think truth-telling works best when we can first address truths within ourselves, right? To address, you know, how can I be a truth teller if I can't be true about the wounds and you know, what am I working from, right? To truly understand where I'm coming from. So I think it starts there. And to be a truth teller in the most engaging way, to me, is not about shaking your finger at someone like, well, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. It's about coming from a place of expressly saying there's something wrong here, right? It's about making observations and not necessarily prescriptions. So I find it easiest to do that in fiction because you know, Christ knew that too, right? That's why he told parables. He got that. So to me, it's the same sort of thing. It's easier to write a story, and in that story, lay out what I've seen, right? Lay out my observations, lay out my thoughts about how something could have been done differently, right? And yet challenging us to think about the way we behave, right? Which would be harder to take if a book was a long didactic on, you know, what's wrong with the world.
Yeah, I was struck when you read that quote from Merton where he's pointing out the bloated society, and yet he said, and I'm part of it. You know,
Yeah.
it's speaking from that essential truth, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question from the audience. Someone is asking, you know, if I know very little about Merton, is there a specific book you would recommend as a starting point, in addition, of course, to your lovely book?
Isn't it interesting? I hear that question a lot, right? So I would say, well, first of all, I don't have it within reach of my hand, but John Sweeney just published a wonderful little book called An Introduction to Thomas Merton. So go get that book to begin with, because that's like an overview. It's a perfect overview of Thomas Merton and his writings. But to get to know Merton himself, start with his autobiography. Just as I did, start with The 7-Story Mountain, because that is the book that introduced him to the world, and that is the book where he's telling you about himself as much as he could, at that point. But then you go from there, and I think I've noticed that people tend to choose their Merton readings based on their own personal interests. So people who are interested in Eastern philosophies will read things like his Asian journals and his I think it's called Zen and the Mystics. He has a book like that. There are people who are interested in his spirituality, and they will tend toward his earlier works like New Seeds of Contemplation. There are people who are interested in activism. They will read his later works. So I say get to know Merton first, and then go with the writing that will make him your Merton.
That's great. Okay, another question. So Merton was certainly an extraordinary, unique individual, but he was also part of a very ancient tradition. When you are conversing with him in this book, to what extent do you sense that you're in touch with the wisdom of the monastic rule, or of the wisdom of the rule of St. Benedict?
He was a Trappist.
Trappist, right? Okay.
Yeah, he was a Trappist. So I'm mainly engaging with Merton the person, and we in the prayer section, right, some of that comes into play, but I think I mainly talk about it with him in his frustrations with the life, right, and whether or not he's suffering from a kind of spiritual boredom called acedia, right? There's a point in his life where he just felt like he had to go to another monastery, that he felt like he couldn't be a true hermit, be in true solitude unless he went elsewhere. So I engage with him on that level. What do you do when you feel itchy about your spirituality, right? So I'm more interested in that very focused personal struggle with spirituality than being part of the larger order.
I love that, spiritual itchiness. That's
Yeah.
it's a great way to describe it.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. So in that negative dynamic emerging in the midst of injustice, the wound, how does that movement from anger to compassion occur? Does Merton speak about that at all?
Well, I will speak about it. It's about looking into the face of the person doing the wrong and seeing them as a human, seeing them as somebody who is hurt, like trying to understand what is going on with that person. And it's not just the big systemic, I'm talking about, person by person, right? So here's an example. So I talked to my son, who is now, he's almost 17 now, and I talk to him whenever police violence, shows up in the news. We talk about, how did that happen, and how do you behave around police? How do you be safe? And he's learning to drive, talking about police stops. One day he stopped me and said, but Mama, my experience of police is very different. And it's true, because we live in Sandy Hook, and he was in the school that day of the shootings. He has had police in his school and at the end of the driveway of his school almost every day of his life until he went to high school. Police mean love. Police mean safety. Police are friends, right? So that is his experience. So person to person, compassion, I can't take that from him. This is what he knows to be true. And I agreed with him. And I said to him, for all we know, that could be his source of nonviolence if he's ever in a difficult situation to what can help him address what is in front of him, and to come from a place of what he knows best, right? So in the moment, are you acting out of what is? Are you acting out of what you know in your heart, person to person, moment by moment? Or are you acting from a big story that is out here, right? That is acting on you to be something that you necessarily as a person would not normally be, right? That takes a huge amount of awareness and focus in any given moment, especially moments of stress. But that is what we're working for. That is what prayer and meditation is all about, right? It's preparing you for that moment where you can choose compassion instead of something else.
Absolutely. This question is about your first experience with Merton. So tell us, has Merton always been part of your life, or do you have a specific moment when you first met Merton?
No, it was a very specific moment. I read, someone recently reviewed my book and talked about how if you go to the Merton conference, everyone has a Merton story, right? About how Merton showed up in their lives. So, so for me, it was, and I can even tell you, it was almost 10 years ago. It was December of 2021, and I just started my MFA program. And I quoted Robert Vivian in this piece, and he's a dear friend of mine. But I first met him, he was giving a lecture about gratitude. And in the lecture, he read an extended passage from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. It's a beautiful passage called How the Valley Awakes. And it's Merton detailing how he can tell what time it is because of the order in which the birds awake. And it turns into this beautiful meditation where he eventually says, paradise is all around and we don't comprehend it. And I heard that, and it just set me on fire. I was like, yes, just yes to all of that. I had no idea who this person was, this Thomas Merton. I have no idea what conjectures of what bystander, but I had to find out what those words were all about and who wrote them and why. And so that's what set me off. And I talk about this in the book, how I tried to borrow a copy of Conjectures from a Guilty Bystander. I had to get it via interlibrary loan. And when I finally got it and was looking for that section, I couldn't find it because the pages had been torn out. And so that's when I realized that I felt like I was being nudged to a deeper exploration. And that's when I got Seven Story Mountain and started looking into other aspects of Merton's work. I always had this sense after reading Seven Story Mountain, though I would tell everyone this, that something was missing in it. I felt like he was being a little, not evasive, but ambiguous about certain details in his life. And that was just, I don't know, just kind of in the back of my head that something was missing there. And later I came upon a biography of Merton, The Seven Mountains of Thomas Merton, in my church library. It's a big book, and I just, flipping through it, and just happened to come upon this part where the author of the book talks about the censorship that Merton's work, anybody at that time, I don't know if it still happens, but anybody writing for the Catholic Church, the work went through a censorship process. And so he dealt with this all his life, and things that were taken out, right? He had fathered a child out of wedlock. That was not in the book. And this biography also mentioned Merton's journals. And I realized, oh, this is where I'm going to find the real Merton, because all of this stuff is censored. So I'm going to go read the stuff that's not censored. So I'm going to go find this person. And because I just felt like it's almost like there was a curtain between us. I felt like there's a friend there. There's somebody I think we can connect. I got to go find him. And that's what I found in those journals. I'm a journal writer anyway. I love letters too. And so I felt like I found his authentic voice there. and I recognized so many aspects of him that I loved and was irked by men I've known growing up. And I was like, oh my gosh, I know this guy, and in some ways he's irritating, but in other ways he's brilliant. And it's like, oh my gosh, I just felt like if I knew this guy, we would be sitting by that pond and just talking, right? And I really do think he would have enjoyed the conversation too, because he enjoyed conversing with women, right? And there are times when he talks about that in his journals. It's so-and-so's sister showed up and we just had the most amazing conversation that went on for hours, right? I felt like, okay, I would have had one of those conversations with him.
Well, that relationship really does come through so clearly in the book. Okay, we have time for just one last question. This question is about the writing process, and the question is, did the writing process lead you to a new or surprising place when you finished the book? If so, was this an experience similar to what you experienced when writing your other books?
The main difference with this book, I have to say, I felt very sad when this book was done, and sad in a different way. So when my most recent novel, Unforgivable Love, when that book was done, it felt like a certain kind of loss. But with this one, it was a very specific loss. Even though I still read Merton, right? I'm still talking about Merton. There's something like a closeness there that I felt would not be there again, So that felt very sad. As much as I know I still feel connected to Thomas Merton, I'm not going to be in it in the way that I was when I was writing that book.
Well, thank you for writing it and for sharing it with the world and for sharing this hour with us. This has just been a delight. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's online with us right now. Thanks for joining us today. We invite you to join us for future Collegeville Connection events. Our next event will be on Wednesday, September 8th. So we're skipping the month of August. We'll be back in September. It will be at the same time, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from our new executive director, Dr. Jacqueline Bussey, who will be in conversation with Collegeville Institute Board Chair, Dr. Bill Cahoy. You'll get to learn more about Dr. Bussey's background, area of expertise, and her passion for the Collegeville Institute's work. So you can find that registration information for our next event right now if you go to our website and click on the events tab. But again, thank you so much, Sophfronia, for being with us today. And thank you to everyone for joining Collegeville Connections. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Stina. Thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate it.
Take care.